Settle down. Settle down. Thank you. Welcome to your classroom. This is Teaching Thursday, your place to learn and expand on the Dean Obeidallah Show.
And welcome back. That was me doing an impression. No, that's not me at all. That's the official announce. That's our new announce for Teaching Thursdays. We're at the end of the hour. I hope we are all, including myself, smarter about the topic. And today we're going to talk about the history of racism in modern-day politics. Begin a little with the Democrats, but to get in earnest with the Republicans from the time of the mid-'60s through today. And I'm joined by not one, but two professors from Princeton University. Julian Zelizer, our buddy who comes on just about every other week from CNN. He's a professor at Princeton University, author of various books, including a new book he co-wrote with Kevin Kruse, Fault Lines: A History of the United States Since 1974. Julian, nice to see you again.
Nice to be here, as always.
And joining us is your co-writer, Kevin
Yes.
Kruse, also professor at Princeton University, author of several books, including White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of the Modern Conservatism, and, of course, Fault Lines with Julian. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Sure, this is great. So I got Julian here in studio and you on the phone. We're going to have a conversation. I am the facilitator in this one. I want to learn as much as everyone else. So please fill in the blanks. Need be. Correct me if I'm wrong. I try not to make statements. I don't know if they're correct or not, but I do my best to be accurate. But I want to talk about the use of racism in American politics. In modern day with the Republicans, to be fair, let's begin in the early 60s. We'll start with Julian, first with you. Conservative Democrats and their open embrace of bullhorn racism. So what was going on then?
Look, in the 1950s and 60s, both parties were divided. So Democrats had Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. The Southerners were very conservative on race. They used racial issues to, stir up the base, so to speak. They were openly opposing desegregation and efforts to achieve voting rights. And Northerners also had two wings of their party. They had liberals from New York, for example, who were pro-civil rights, like Northern Democrats. And they had Midwesterners who were often big opponents of any civil rights legislation. So you had these two parties divided, and the conservative Democrats had a lot of power until the 1960s. Through the 1960s, they controlled the committees in Congress. So they would do a lot to try to stifle civil rights. They were at war with their own party, meaning they were at war with Northern Democrats who really, like Hubert Humphrey, who were pushing with everything they had to get civil rights legislation.
And obviously George Wallace famously, when he won election in 1962, when his inauguration speech in Alabama said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So Kevin, what began to change this where it became, we saw conservative Democrats not using as much, or what happened in the party realignment that this actually happened now we know it more for Republicans?
Yeah, there's a long process that really transforms the Democratic Party. And before those conservative Southern Democrats leave the party, there's a new group coming in. That's African-American voters.
Okay. Voters
who had long considered the Republican Party to be, as they often knew it, the party of Lincoln, right? Mm-hmm. The party of ending slavery, of liberating African Americans from that institution, and so they had long remained loyal to them. And what happens in the 1930s is, with a New Deal, first they ignore Roosevelt. 1932, they're the last people who stick by Hoover. That's how loyal they are to the Republican Party. 1936, they shift en masse over to the Democrats, and it's not because of anything they've done on civil rights. This is still, as Julian said, this is a party that's controlled by Southern segregationists in Congress, especially. Mm-hmm. And in the Southern states, it's Democrats who are running these states and implementing Jim Crow. But they switch nationally to the Democratic Party because they are benefiting economically from the New Deal. But again, they do it not because of anything the party did on civil rights, but rather in spite of it. And so with that new presence of African Americans in the party starts to shift. It starts to shed that old Southern control. There's convention rule changes where the Southerners basically don't have a veto power anymore. The Supreme Court strikes down the white primary during World War II. And then most importantly is in 1948, Harry Truman embraces civil rights and makes it a political issue for the first time on the national stage. And what he does there is he very strongly embraces this policy, which had actually come about as a result of a presidential commission he appoints after he hears about black veterans being lynched in the South. Some of them were in uniform. It sickens him. And so he has an awakening on this issue. And in 1948, he advances this, and he gets the liberals in the party, who had been kind of on the ropes on this issue. They find their voice with Harry Truman, and they have a strong civil rights plank in the Democratic platform for the first time in 1948. This is what triggers the famous Dixiecrat walkout of 48.
So Julian, it's interesting that Kevin talks about that Harry Truman was the one that embraced it, because FDR had great numbers in a majority in Congress, but he had to deal with these Democrats. In fact, even if I remember correctly, the National Labor Relations Act, I think Robert Wagner from New York was the one that wrote it, and they were able to certify, in the law, instead of making it that you can only certify federal unions that were integrated, they were allowed to do it segregated, because he had to compromise so much with the conservative Democrats. That's how much power they had. So when you get past Truman, then it seems to me the next big milestone is 64 and 65, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Are those big touchstones in the transformation of parties?
Massive. I mean, the first civil rights bill is in 1957. It's one that's forgotten. It was a modest measure. But then 64 and 65 opened the floodgates. Those are both led by Democrats. Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, and Kennedy, before he died, is pushing for it. And all these Northern Democrats who, since Hubert Humphrey in 1948, had been telling the Southerners in their party, get out if you're not going to help us on civil rights, they're starting to gain much more power. And Johnson has now flipped. He had been an opponent of civil rights legislation, but he is, by 64, pushing for it. And so by 1965, even though those Southern Democrats are still in the party, those segregationists, the party's getting a new face, a new definition of being the party of civil rights. They do work with Republicans in the Senate to get the bills through. They need those votes to overcome the filibuster. But these are Democratic bills, and there's a lot of Southern Democrats who are really unhappy by 66 and 67 that their party has changed on this fundamental issue. And
Kevin, how much did Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee in 64, did he deal with the civil rights issue and trying to oppose civil rights and the Civil Rights Act, or try to reverse it?
Yeah, so Goldwater is one of the handful of Republicans who votes against the Civil Rights Act. Now, personally, he's not a bigot. He had said in 1960 in one of his books, Conscience of a Conservative, that it's right and just for black and white kids to go to school together. But he doesn't believe that the federal government should be involved. And for white Southerners, that's a distinction without a difference. They really don't care why he opposes the Civil Rights Act. All they know is that Lyndon Johnson and the Northern Democrats are pressing this case hard, and here's Barry Goldwater opposing it. And if those are your two choices for president, the choice is clear. So Goldwater does, outside of Arizona, the only states he wins are in the Deep South, and it's because of this issue. This is when Trent Lott famously says later on that, 1964 with Barry Goldwater, that was the first time a lot of us started thinking, hey, maybe we are Republican after all.
And when you put it in that context, actually funny, because it's so in your face. I mean, but compared to Steve King today, it's nothing. It's cute. But now I read disputing things, Julian, the idea that LBJ said when he signed the Civil Rights Act, we've lost the South for a generation. And at first I thought that was true statement. Now it seems potentially not true. Do you think LBJ, though, had a sense that if I sign this, I'm going to cause potentially a party realignment?
Yeah, I mean, look, absolutely. That comes from Bill Moyer's recollection. It was very close to him. It still might be true. It's disputed, but the sentiment totally captures what Johnson understood. This was a huge risk that he took in pushing for both of these bills. He understood the ire that would come from the South. He understood Republicans were going to make a play for the region. And he wasn't thinking, I'm going to have more votes in northern states or in swing states. It was just a risk that he felt by that time, because of the civil rights movement, he was going to take. But the realignment will start happening. By the end of the 60s and early 70s, the Republicans are consciously trying to win over these Southern white voters who are really angry with what the rest of their party did.
Kevin, was it, and we'll get into the Southern strategy in a second, Kevin, when did you see actually elected officials, though, not people, voters, but elected officials switch parties much? Was that happening with any big names in the late 60s?
Yeah, it happens in fits and starts, and it's something that if you look at kind of senators and congressmen here, you're going to miss it. Because as Julian will tell you, this is a period when congressmen really got their power through seniority. And so if you had been there for a long time and racked up a number of years as a member of either the Republican or the Democratic caucus, that translated to getting a powerful chair of one of these big committees, right? And that is where all your power came from. So to switch parties basically meant to scrap all you'd invested in your time in Congress and to start over from the bottom. Now, one guy gets a special deal, and that's Strom Thurmond, who had been the Dixiecrat presidential candidate in 1948. He goes back in the Democratic Party. He feels increasingly he's on the losing end of civil rights. In September of 1964, he makes a very public big switch over to the Republicans. Goldwater welcomes it with open arms, but more importantly, the Republican Party lets him keep his seniority, which means that he doesn't sacrifice his career by switching parties. It's an easy transition. There's an effort after that, and William F. Buckley writes about this in the late 60s, to try to woo other conservative Southern Democrats to get them over to do what Thurmond did. The problem is that the rest of the Republican Party doesn't want to let these Democrats cut in line. Right. So they refuse to let them have the same kind of deal on their seniority. And so they generally stay put and ride out their careers as Democrats. Everyone knows they're conservative. Everyone knows they're going to vote against civil rights measures. Everyone knows where they stand on race. But they are formally still Democrats. What they do, though, is they tell the next generation to run as Republicans. So to go back to Trent Lott, who in '64 says, "Hey, maybe I am a Republican." He stays a Democrat throughout the late '60s. He works for William Colmer, who's a Mississippi congressman, who's I think head of Ways and Means at the time, a really powerful committee in Congress. When Colmer retires, he wants Trent Lott, his aide, to run for his seat, but he says, if you're going to run, you got to run as a Republican. Right, so that's the way in which the transition really happens. It happens in fits and starts over these years. The old guys largely stay Democrat and die out. Some of them are replaced by other Democrats, but it's usually this kind of shift over the 70s and 80s. It's really not until 1994 that you really see the South's elected officials in Congress have finally all really become Republicans.
And it's Julian, I've spoke. Did you ever deal with Jeffrey Lord when you were at CNN? Or?
Once. All
right. I used to call him with him a lot. And we used to fight on Twitter a lot. Not recently, but he would bring up it was the Democrats who wanted segregation. And technically he was right when he's talking about the early 60s. But ultimately, is it fair to say, or is this too simplistic to say that those people were conservatives first and that was the ideology? It wasn't about party, because the Democratic Party was split. So later they became more comfortable in the Republican Party where conservatives were welcome. It wasn't, because Jeffrey's trying to do this disingenuous, intellectually dishonest argument that progressives are somehow the ones who wanted segregation because we were Democrats. I'm like, no. They were conservatives first and Democrats second because they were comfortable still being conservatives with another party label. Is that too simplistic? Or?
That argument that he makes is not uncommon, and it really is simplistic. Look, you do have some Southern white racists who were economic populists, meaning they were for federal programs for white voters in their district. Even George Wallace had some of this in his record. But they are very different than the other Democrats. The drive for civil rights by the 50s and 60s is coming from Northerners from states like Missouri, Minnesota, and here in New York. And they're not in this. They're in the same party, but they're not the same party. There's no way to align them. So yes, by the 60s, they're Democrats, but they are really defining themselves around these racial issues. So to somehow blame the entire party really misses this division, and it misses the fact there are a lot of Republicans who are opposing civil rights. Until 1964, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who will ultimately bring the votes over, isn't supporting civil rights legislation. He's very ambivalent about it. He says the federal government shouldn't get involved in these things. So I think that whole picture really it's a totally skewed picture of how this unfolded.
Well, that's completely consistent with Jeffrey Lord. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to pick up more with getting closer to modern day politics, the idea of the Southern strategy. What is that? Its genesis, how we still see it in a way today, but we'll go through the presidential Republican presidents and how they use it, from Nixon to Bush the father and Ronald Reagan. And at some point, we'll get to the monster himself, Donald Trump. So let's take a quick break. We're coming back Teaching Thursdays with Julian Zelizer, our friend, and Kevin Kruse, co-authors of the great new book, Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. Be right back after this. Progressive values are the best of American values, and we need to keep fighting for them to save our country.
Don't go anywhere. This is the Dean Obadala Show on Sirius XM Progress 127.
Investigating the subjects you need to know about. This is Teaching Thursday on the Dean Obadala Show.
And welcome back. I just got smarter listening to that guy's announcement. I'm Dean Obadala. I'm joined tonight on Teaching Thursdays. We're looking an hour look at now the history of the Republican Party's use of racism to win elections. Joined by Julian Zelizer, a professor at Princeton, co-author of Fault Lines, and Kevin Kruse, also professor at Princeton University, co-author of Fault Lines. So let's pick it up here with the expression talked about forever, the Southern strategy. Julian, let's start with you. What is the Southern strategy?
Look, this was a strategy that the Republican Party undertook in the aftermath of what we were talking about. And the big vision was Southern Democrats were gettable votes, and that Southerners, the Republican Party, had to move its base to the South. And the way in which they were going to do that was to play on the backlash and anger about the civil rights legislation. It was pretty clear, even though it was talked about in the abstract, what the main issue is. So Richard Nixon, which is actually where our book starts,
right,
is really the first president. I mean, Eisenhower actually does some of this, but Nixon really embraces the Southern strategy strategy, and he's going to try to shift the base of the Republican Party to this region where there had been basically no Republicans since the 19th century. And either explicitly or subtly playing on these racial concerns is at the core of how they're going to do it.
And Kevin, what's some examples of what Nixon did using the Southern strategy?
Well, he tries it in a couple different ways. In the 1970 midterms is where he really goes full-throated with it.
So 68, he didn't use it in the election in 68? It was not used yet?
It was not used yet because George Wallace is running, and they think the South is George Wallace is running as an independent. They think the
right.
South is a lost cause.
Okay.
And again, you've got a slightly more polite version of the stark racism they tried before, and instead try to pitch towards the white conservative in the suburbs, right? And here they pitch it as, and this is why whenever Nixon would say we don't have a Southern strategy, behind the scenes they talked about it, but when in publicly he would say we don't have a Southern strategy, we have an American strategy.
Sure.
Is that he would try to claim that the South was like the rest of the country, and in the suburbs it kind of was. And so they reached out and they made moves to seal the suburbs off from metropolitan programs of integration, either through the busing of school children or the placement of public housing out in the suburbs. This is what governs Nixon's entire Supreme Court strategy. He outlines this with his Attorney General, John Mitchell. He says, look, I want conservatives, and by conservatives I mean they're against forced busing and forced housing integration. Beyond that, they can do whatever they please. That's the number one issue for him, because he knows it's going to play well in the South, but it's also going to play well in suburbs across the country, and that's going to be his way to make an inroad in the South. He also uses Harry Dent, who'd been an aide of Strom Thurmond, who really helps formulate this approach to the South, and they're trying subtly to win over these voters. It's what Kevin Phillips, who's the big Republican strategist at the time, kind of the Karl Rove of that, or the Steve Bannon of that period. He says, and it says publicly in an interview in 1970 in the New York Times, Negrophobe voters, or how he calls it, it's a very dated term, but Negrophobe voters in the South are going to come over to our party, and it's just a matter of
Negrophobe voters. So voters who are afraid of black people are going to vote for the Republican Party.
And that's, I mean, what Kevin's saying is important in that it's not just the Southern strategy. Nixon and then Republicans who follow him are often in different ways, directly or indirectly, going after civil rights measures that often also have a lot of opposition in the North. So school busing becomes a real flashpoint in the 1970s. And this is a way you can talk about school busing and your opposition to it, but you're playing to that racial anger. Law and order, that's one place in 68 Nixon already did start to kind of try to tap into the anger of what people were seeing. And in the 70s and 80s, Reagan as well, this becomes one of the central themes. And it's often loaded with racial imagery and has support, in different regions of the country that the Republicans are trying to win over. As Republicans with Nixon and then Reagan in the 80s try to win over northern white voters, the white backlash is also really important, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct in how they hope to do this.
How does, Kevin, everyone talks about law and order being coded language to appeal, sort of part of the Southern strategy. Why is law and order effective in that way? At that time, I would say.
It's effective in that way because it's a way to push back against civil rights demonstrations and anti-war demonstrations at the time in a way that seems to be not racist or not pushing for the war. It's just who's against law and order. That's a positive thing. Everyone seems to feel like that's a good thing in civilized society. It's like family values, right? It's a way to spin it and phrase it in a way that doesn't seem to be that you're saying I'm in favor of segregation or I'm in favor of people kind of staying in their place, but rather it seems positive.
So, but I'm trying to get at, and I'm sincerely trying to understand this myself, because I hear now, and I've read it too all the time, it uses law and order as code for a racial dog whistle. Is that because at the time of its genesis, there was so much civil disobedience and violence in the streets that people said, when you said law and order, you were talking to white voters because they were looking at what was in the streets and they go, oh, that was black people or brown people doing that. I'm speaking to you. I'm trying to get that understanding of why.
Yeah, I mean, literally, if you're talking about law and order in 68, or even the early 70s, the images that are often invoked, they're either anti-war protests, which are white college kids, but also the riots in the 60s, like the Watts riot, the Detroit riots, the Newark riots, in African-American areas often. And that's kind of what they were trying to invoke. And even as we move farther away from that in the 1970s and 80s, some Republicans are pretty explicit that they're still trying to tap into that same sentiment. It often shifts to the inner city, where you have worsening poverty in these parts of the country, and often with it crime. This becomes where you can target law and order. And one of the figures who's crucial is Lee Atwater, who's a Republican campaign consultant from South Carolina, and he'll run the '88 campaign for George H.W. Bush. He works for Reagan as well, and he's someone who kind of thinks a lot. He talks in a famous interview, how can you talk about these racial issues and try to appeal to this sentiment without saying it? And I just, he starts, you start out in 1954 by saying N, the N-word. Right. By 1968, Atwater said you can't say that. That hurts you. Backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting abstract. And then he says, and then you talk about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And he goes on, but it's the same kind of anger that you're trying to appeal to.
It's interesting you said it. So let's, by the way, Kevin, because I want to get to the modern day, but I want to touch on how we got here to Trump. In 72, did Nixon do anything that stands out if we're trying to track the journey to modern day open bigotry or racism by some on the right in his reelection campaign? Or was he so favored against McGovern he didn't need to?
He didn't really need to. I mean, there's a little worry there because George Wallace ran strong in 72 again, and this time he runs as a Democrat. And he looks like he's on the way to wrapping up the nomination when he's actually shot in a Maryland parking lot at a shopping center by Arthur Brunner. And once Wallace is effectively out of the race, he lives, but he's basically he doesn't have the ability really to capture the nomination now. He loses a lot of time. He loses a lot of energy. Once he's out, and Nixon realizes he's running against McGovern, there's no real need to really press that issue. He knows he's got those votes.
Right.
He spent 4 years really echoing the Wallace line. George Wallace jokes in that first, I think in '69, he says, I wish I'd copyrighted my speeches because Nixon and Agnew keep stealing them.
Right.
And they stole from him. This is another reason law and order is a loaded term. It's Wallace who really pioneers it, right? Wallace does it, and he does it in ads that are very clear about who he's talking about and what he's talking about. And when Nixon co-opts that language, that association comes with it. So Nixon had really largely wrapped that up.
So I mean, it's by the end of the 70s, it is there. It's part of it, and Reagan even makes a famous speech.
I want to get to Reagan, but when you've got Gerald Ford losing 76, and there's a lot of issues going on.
A lot of
Watergate.
Issues.
He's not even he's not even elected. Drop dead New York, the whole thing, stuff like that. So, but was there any lessons from the loss of 76 that Reagan used in 1980, actually amping up? And I'm trying to get to: are we seeing an elevation or a heightening of the use of the Southern strategy and racist dog whistles through time? You get the 76-day lose. Are there any lessons that Reagan says, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to make sure we win, and I don't care what I have to do? I
think we have to be careful in that. So the answer is yes, Reagan shifts to the right. And Reagan, who challenges Ford in 1976, he had argued Ford is basically almost a Democrat. He's too moderate. He's too in the center, and he wasn't. But that's how he portrays. So Reagan, when he runs in 80, there's many parts of his strategy, but one is really appealing to the right wing, to this new conservative movement in the United States. It's not all about race. It's about anti-communism. It's attack on abortion rights. There's lots of issues, taxation. But one issue that does creep up already are subtle appeals to this. He's going after people who are on welfare, and often the image that's drawn up is of an African American as opposed to a poor white.
Expression, right? Welfare queen.
Welfare queen. He'll use, and he gives a speech in Mississippi,
Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Yeah, not right there, but Kevin, it's like 7 miles or something from where 3 civil rights activists were killed. He talks about states' rights. And to this day, his supporters will say it was about states' rights, but others say that's a pretty loaded place to make that speech, and that's a term that was wrapped up in
I've mentioned that.
positive.
I put that in an article for the Daily Beast. My editor made me take it out. Go, that was a reach to say. I said he could have announced anywhere.
Right.
I think that's what Ronald Reagan announced in 1980, Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Mississippi Burning, the movie, the three civil rights activists, the two young Jewish American kids and the African American guy were killed and dumped there. I'm like, that was not a coincidence. And thankfully, Julian Zelizer is smarter than my editor. He's still my editor at Daily Beast, so I won't mention his name. So Kevin, welfare queen is one of the things that if you're going to look at Reagan and what he talked about, is something that jumps out at sort of the Southern strategy. Why did welfare queen? Why is it such a loaded term? Kevin, we lose Kevin?
Oh, sorry. I thought we were still on Julian.
No, for you, Kevin. So what do you think?
I was enwrapped in the conversation.
Welfare queen. So why is that? It always jumps out when people talk about the use of coded racial dog whistle by Reagan.
Yeah, well, it stands out because it's a story that, and it's based on a kernel of truth, but Reagan tells it and spins it out to become this kind of larger than life emblem of people who are milking the system, are basically cheating it, getting rich somehow off the welfare system, and that's a sign, A, that the government is ineffectual, but also that there's a certain class of people out there, and it was always coded poor and African American, who are unworthy of government aid, right? And so that reaches out to, this is a way to come back to, as Julian said, those George Wallace voters. George Wallace never had an objection to the government doing things. He didn't have an objection to the New Deal state. What he objected to was what he saw under Lyndon Johnson. He felt that the beneficiaries of the Democratic state were no longer the white working classes that had been in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He thought it was now a zero-sum game in which all the benefits were going to go to African Americans, right? And that is what that welfare queen trope feeds right into, the sense that they are getting the benefits that should be yours.
And the one thing I will say about Reagan, and maybe it's too nice to say, but in that there's maybe more complexity to it. You know, when the Klan endorsed him, he put out a very clear statement against the Klan. And he did speak at Jewish temples denouncing anti-Semitism in unequivocal, passionate ways. What a contrast to Donald Trump, completely different. So anything else jump out? Before, we're going to take a break and come back and talk about George Bush, the father. But anything else about Reagan that we missed? Because everyone talked about welfare queens, but any other place that Reagan used the Southern strategy that jumped out at you?
Well, again, it's not necessarily the Southern strategy, but it's the racial strategy, and it's criminal justice. I mean, the welfare queens, the discussion of poverty, it was all part of a bigger attack on the welfare state and a call for law and order, but it often skewed what the reality was. So on Law and Order, it was often about certain drugs that were being found in the inner city and African American communities, while not really dealing with other kinds of drugs like cocaine that were popular with wealthy white America. Welfare Queens was criticized because he was focusing on this case, while a lot of welfare actually went to white Americans. And so he didn't draw his example from that pool. So this broader shift in public debate about these kinds of questions is where some historians say Reagan, who is about a lot of issues, but this was part of the mix already in conservatism in the 1980s. At least politically, he saw that it could give him some traction.
So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about George Herbert Walker Bush, down by 17 points after the Democratic convention, as you know in your book Fault Lines. And what does he turn to, and who does he turn to but Lee Atwater? And we'll come back and explain more of that right here on the Dino Bidala Show. Look, it's time the media start calling out Trump's false statements for what they are. Lies. Trump is a liar. And by the looks of it, he's lying every day and twice on Sundays.
The Dino Bidala Show.
Settle down. Settle down. Thank you. Welcome to your classroom. This is Teaching Thursday, your place to learn and expand on the Dean Obeidallah Show.
Thank you. Thank you. That's not pompous enough. We need something even more, something ending with like Grey Poupon, and I'm better than you. I'm chatting here with Julian Zelizer and Kevin Kruse, professors at Princeton, co-authors of the great new book, Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. So we're at George Herbert Walker Bush. You wrote about in Fault Lines a great deal. He's down by 17 points. I think the most a Republican candidate was after a Democratic convention, maybe in the modern day. So George W. H.W. Bush goes to the guy you talked about earlier.
Lee Atwater. And here you can see, look, here you can see the Republican establishment, quote unquote, align with these elements. Atwater sees that Michael Dukakis is doing pretty well. And Atwater believes in unleashing everything in that campaign. He runs one of the most vicious campaigns that we had. And part of it includes one of the more notorious racial ads, and it's about a furlough program that was put into place in Massachusetts, and he ties it to Dukakis, and an African-American had been let out for the weekend and commits a horrible act. And there's two ads. One's run by an independent group, which features Willie Horton, and another doesn't feature Willie Horton, but it has a bunch of faces, and it's about the furlough program. And Atwater would later apologize for this toward the end of his life. They were aiming at playing on these kinds of racial resentments to build support for President Bush, whose support was kind of weak. And Atwater really showed modern republicanism, modern campaigning, how they could come together with these kinds of ads, and he really perfected it.
You know, I read some description where we called the Willie Horton ad because they did, but Willie Horton didn't call himself Willie. He called himself William, and all the court documents and times he was referred to as William, they made it Willie to make it seem more, I guess, urban.
Yeah.
But Kevin, I mean, maybe this is too naive, but why is an ad like that effective? Why did it work?
Why did it work? Well, because it was. I mean, the crime he committed was he'd gone down to Maryland, attacked a couple, raped the woman,
and she was white, right?
She was white,
and he's black. So here's that deep-seated fear.
Exactly. You've got this close-up of the mugshot ad, the one that Atwater knew he had to put out in this independent group, the famous mugshot ad. It's an independent group. It runs lightly. It gets picked up by the McLaughlin group. Then the networks start running it, and it's all over the news. But their fingerprints aren't on it. Atwater denied they ever had it because he knew how toxic it was. Because it's an ad that really did press into the central fear of a lot of white folks, and it goes back to the earlier days of Jim Crow and on into slavery. The fear about black rapists, and they're gonna come get you. They're gonna come ruin your life. You've got to be scared of them. And Michael Dukakis made this happen, and they pinned this crime on Michael Dukakis, and that is the bombshell.
So, I mean, since we are limited in time, I think it's a good jumping point to current day, because you just mentioned, Kevin, that they ran this ad through an independent group. They didn't want it tied to the campaign, that they're making white people afraid if black people are going to come rape them, their wives. Cut to Donald Trump coming down an escalator, June 2015. There's no need for an independent campaign or hiding it. He comes down and says Mexico is sending rapists here. So where we are, I mean, it's almost nostalgic, and this ad's horrible that they did, but it was one ad, and the president himself at the time, Bush, did not engage in that, and they made it seem that I don't want my hands on it. Now you have a guy win the Republican nomination easily, openly spewing anti-Latino, calling for a total complete shutdown on Muslims, which was one of the most stunning things I've ever seen in my lifetime. And he wins the Republican nomination easily. What does that say about the GOP today?
Well, it says what was in party politics for Republicans in the 1980s and 1990s, but it was still contained, or it still wasn't front and center, and it certainly wasn't openly embraced as the main message, had become elevated. Because unlike George H.W. Bush, President Trump is willing to own these kinds of issues and from the campaign onward talk about them all the time without any kind of hesitation. And he's also willing to make it central. So even George H.W. Bush, that was something he did in his campaign, and it will forever haunt his legacy. But he was about a lot of other issues, really, ending the Cold War, tax cuts, and deregulation. But Trump has made this a centerpiece, this kind of white nationalistic rhetoric, really important from day one. And so that's why we're in a different era. And there's no other conclusion but that this works in Republican politics circa 2017 and 2018. And you can argue, well, not all Trump voters believe in this. But the fact is not that. The fact is you can do it and you can still be the nominee, the president, and still hold the support of the party. So that tells you a lot about where the party is.
And Kevin, we talk about Ronald Reagan using welfare queens. Do you think Donald Trump, and he's not that subtle, but it is more arguably subtle, that saying that Maxine Waters has low IQ and calling leading black people dumb and unintelligent, is that similar as a welfare queen? Is that playing on coded language?
I don't think it's very coded. I think it's out in the open. I mean, he's calling prominent African American figures stupid, I'm pretty sure if we had a spelling test between Maxine Waters and Donald Trump, I would put my money on Waters. I think she could at least spell hamburger, but I don't think it's subtle at all. But I do think Julian's and your point is really right. Is that what's remarkable here is just how out in the open it is. And how, think about Charlottesville. To say that there are very fine people on both sides of a neo-Nazi march and a counter-protest is really remarkable. It's usually a pretty easy layup for a president to condemn the Klan, to condemn neo-Nazis. As you noted, Reagan did it. George H.W. Bush, when David Duke is running in Louisiana, forcefully rejects him there. It's a marked change from what we've got now, where the President of the United States is both siding the Klan and people who say the Klan is bad.
And in '88, when Bush did this in the ad, it was an ad. It went away. What Bush didn't have yet was what's behind our head in the studio, which is Fox News.
Tucker Klansman,
and this massive conservative media infrastructure that's not marginal. It's not little newspapers that you might pick up at a rally. Right. It's a major network that often echoes these issues. With the Caravan, it became the vehicle through which you actually saw the images. It did the work of a Willie Horton ad every single day, but packaged as news, not a campaign ad. And that's a really fundamental change since '88 to 2018, 19 that I think makes this whole thing much more toxic and dangerous.
And you want to know how Donald Trump has subtly mainstreamed racism is that a few days ago, he was asked, what's your response to Congressman Stephen King defending white supremacy? And his response is, I'm not really following the news. And that's the end of the story. And even when I pitched to an editor about calling that out, they go, it's so cliche to call it out. Of course, he's not going to denounce white supremacy. And I go, shouldn't we still call that out every time? And they're like, the idea was no one's going to click on it. He didn't have to say it, but he goes, oh, come on. Everyone knows that. He's not going to denounce Stephen King. Come on. But I'm like, I have a transcript of him in October at a rally for King when he was running for re-election, praising Stephen King by name. Isn't it more important than ever to say, and other Republicans were there, Joni Ernst and others. I'm like, how come? And at least they did call it out. So why do you think, though, the Republicans, they didn't with Trump, but with Stephen King, they were slightly more forceful. I mean, Kevin McCarthy did take away committee assignments. So Julian, why do you think the reaction to King was actually slightly real, concrete?
Well, the reaction came after a long time, and so it wasn't real, and that they were. This is the worst secret, if it was a secret. He talked about this stuff all the time. Everyone knew he was a white nationalist and tied to these groups. And I think it was the 2018 election. House Republicans are certainly scared. Senate Republicans are scared. They understand some of the potential costs. And here you just had such an extreme case. They said, well, let's purge this person, at least of his rights, and maybe that will clean up the image of the party. It won't work because there's a bigger voice who echoes the same kinds of his sentiments, and he's in the White House. But I think it was politics. It was partisanship. It wasn't principle. This was a partisan calculation by the GOP. We have to do something or we'll pay more of a cost.
All right, let's take a quick break. We'll come back for the last few minutes, sort of where do we go from here, and will it get worse or better as the demographic threat to white people who are concerned about it will get more acute? They will become a minority. And what does that mean in terms of politicians appealing to even worse things than Donald Trump in the future? Let's take a break, come right back.
Dean Obadala Show on Sirius XM Progress 127.
Investigating the subjects you need to know about. This is Teaching Thursday on the Dean Obadala Show.
Welcome back to Pomp and Circumstance with Dean Obadala. I'm here with Julian Zelizer and Kevin Kruse, co-authors of the great book Fault Lines, A History of the United States since 1974. Both professors at Princeton University, a school that rejected me, and I'm just getting over it now, years later. So, Kevin and Julian, we only got about 2.5 minutes. I want to get your take, both of you, and I'll go Julian first, because I'll go to Kevin first, because Julian here I can look at and go, stop. Look, demographic change in America is happening. So white people who are truly fearful they're becoming a minority is going to happen. There's nothing we can do about it. And I fear politicians embrace that, and Trump might be a coming attraction as opposed to an aberration. Kevin, we have 2 minutes, so I'll give you a minute, then Julian. What do you see as the potential future on dog whistle races, just out in their face racism?
Well, we've gone beyond the dog whistle. It's a bullhorn now.
Right.
And I think as this core audience of Fox News viewers, who's really the Trump base, as they get more and more hard of hearing, it's going to get louder. And it's going to get louder because as those numbers shrink, that panic is going to become more pronounced, and the party's going to double down more and more on this. So you just see, Trump following the wishes of Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh on the shutdown on the wall. That's where we're headed. It's going to be more and more of that, of really following what those voices on the right-wing media want them to do.
Everything that's allowed President Trump and Stephen King's to do this doesn't go away in 2020 or 2024. It all is still in place. And the voters who like this, they're energized and they will remain so. So it's going to take a lot of hard work to push back against this counter reaction to the 1960s social movements.
So it began a long time ago through today. Folks, I am smarter. I hope you are. I want to thank Julian and Kevin. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And check out their brand new book, Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. Hope people buy it. Support Kevin and Julian. They're starving Princeton professors. They need to put food on the table. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Kevin, thanks. Hopefully I'll meet you in the future. Julian, great seeing you again. I'll see you probably in a week or two.
Yeah.
Have a great night, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow right back here on the Dean Obidala Show.